Jefferson and Madison and William O. Douglas and everybody who took a stand for human liberty would be turning in their graves.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Judge Andrew Napolitano. He's a Fox News legal analyst, and he is the author of many books, most recently the brand new book with a foreword by Rand Paul. It's called Suicide Pact, The Radical Expansion of Presidential Powers and the Assault on Civil Liberties. Judge, thanks for talking to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Nick.
All right, let's get right to it. The radical expansion of presidential powers and the assault on civil liberties. This is a history going back to the early Republican period. You say that the driving force here is war, real and imagined. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, well, the first half of this book is a history of presidential lawmaking and law-breaking, starting with George Washington and going to Bill Clinton. Second half of the book focuses in great detail on the executive orders and the unlawful actions of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So a lot of the historical stuff is familiar to readers and some is not familiar. It's interesting. I find that if readers went to a public high school, they don't know a lot of the history in here. If they were homeschooled or if they went to a private school or a religious school, they know a lot of this stuff.
What explains that?
The public schools have a built-in need to reinforce the primacy of government as the benefactor of our rights.
So talk about, just very quickly, and I want to spend most of our time talking about Obama and George Bush,
right.
W. Bush, but George Washington, what was the original sin here?
Well, George Washington actually engaged in a lot of bizarre activity involving his slaves, much of which is owned. Remember, the first capital of the country was Philadelphia, and the Pennsylvania legislature required manumission of slaves after 6 months. So George and Martha just ran the slaves up from Mount Vernon, and at the end of the 6 months just sent them back, so they had a continual train of slaves. Unfortunately, when they tried to escape, he cut their toes off. And unfortunately, when he and his children needed teeth, he pulled their teeth out. One of the more egregious things about George Washington was his chopping the heads off of soldiers in the Continental Army. So he wasn't yet the president. There wasn't yet a country, even though they were volunteers. John Adams, we see prosecuting people for speech under the Alien and Sedition Acts. Abraham Lincoln's excesses are well known, but among the more egregious is the suspension of writ of habeas corpus, and arresting 3,000 newspaper publishers in the North for being critical of him in their editorials. Woodrow Wilson had FBI agents arrest people for singing German songs in public and for reciting the Declaration of Independence outside of draft boards. FDR had FBI agents confiscate gold. He forgot that only the Congress could make the ownership of gold unlawful. The theme is not only war, because war is the health of the state. In war, people will willingly pay more taxes. They will willingly stand in line for things that if the government didn't regulate them, there'd be plenty of. And they will willingly accept the interference with their liberty from the government because they think they'll be kept safe. But the value theme, not the history theme, the value theme is that each president relies on the uncorrected, uninterfered with, unlawful behavior of his predecessors to justify what he is doing. Barack Obama relied on some of the things that FDR did and George W. Bush did to justify what he's doing.
Well, let's talk about Obama real quick then, because at one point...
He's helping me sell the book, Nick, with what he's doing with immigration as we speak.
Right, because I assume that you're in favor of more open borders and more immigration.
I am absolutely in favor of open borders because of your natural right to travel wherever you want to go, and because I believe more immigrants, a rising tide lifts all ships.
That's right.
Not a popular view with the place where I work during the day, but I believe that.
But you can't put up with the way that Obama is trying to create immigration law.
Well, when President Obama says to 5 million foreign nationals, if you do A, B, C, D, and E, you won't be deported. And he makes up the A, B, C, D, and E and defies the laws written by Congress, laws that were there at the time he took his first presidential oath. What is he doing? He's disenfranchising the American voters who elected Congress to write the laws. He's superseding a co-equal branch of the government by writing his own laws. If that is not impeachable territory, it's hard to imagine what would be.
He has said that there's a balance to be struck between liberty and security.
Every one of his predecessors has said that except for Thomas Jefferson.
And this is my question. Is there a balance to be struck?
No, there is no balance to be struck. The relationship between liberty and safety is bias, a bias in favor of liberty. Liberty is the default position. If our rights come from our humanity, as Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, if the source of our rights is our humanity, whether you believe we were created by an all-knowing God or whether you think we're just the highest and strongest naturally existing creature on the planet at the moment, then the government can't take our rights away by a majority vote. And if that is the case, then there is no balance between liberty and safety, because when the government wants safety and it needs my liberty, it must persuade me to give up my liberty. You can't give up my liberty. I can't give up yours. The Congress can't give up both of ours.
To put that in a historical context, was it right during World War II, a war that most, everybody agrees that we should have been involved in? Was it right to have rationing? Was it right to have the government temporarily take over, commandeer private resources, whether they were businesses or
Well, not only was it not right, it wasn't constitutional. The half dozen cases in which it was challenged, the courts ruled in favor of the government. But which would you prefer ration goods? The government, which will always give itself what it needs first, or the free market, which when unregulated, will engage in a pure and nearly perfect rationing called supply and demand.
So you don't think that the government during World War II could say to private industry, stop using rubber to do this, we need it for tires?
Absolutely not. The government has to pay for it just like everybody else. And in fact, if the government had stayed out, my parents would have been able to buy shoe leather and coffee and tea and sugar when they were teenagers, rather than having to wait online as if they were in the Soviet Union.
You talked about natural rights, natural law, where our rights come from. The book starts early on. You mentioned St. Thomas More.
I'm a big fan of St. Thomas More.
And explain for those of us who have not seen A Man for All Seasons or
read the play by Robert Bolt.
Read the play or gone to Catholic school.
When I was an undergraduate, or when I was a law student, at the University of Notre Dame, before classes started my first year, I went into the bowels of the library to find the transcript of the trial of Sir Thomas More. It was a handwritten transcript. I'm sure it was a copy. I don't know that it was an original. And I read it, and I also read the famous play on which the movie is made, Robert Bolt, written by a Protestant, by the way. And Bolt was absolutely faithful to the language of the trial. And
Thomas More, just to put it in context, he was the Prime Minister, essentially, for Henry VIII.
Correct. The charge was treason. Under the horrific law at the time, the proven treason was his silence, his refusal to say affirmatively that the king is the head of the church on earth. So More made a mistake. He defended himself. Made a mistake. A lawyer who represents himself as a fool for a client. But as a practical matter, the deck was stacked against him. I mean, he could have had the Archangel Gabriel there defending him, and he still would have lost. In the course of defending himself, he makes a great defense of the natural law by arguing to the jury the following. This is directly from the transcript, which was adapted in the play. Some men say the earth is round and some men say it's flat. A legitimate area of dispute in that time. We're talking about 1535. But if it is round, could the king's command flatten it? And if it is flat, could an act of parliament make it round? Now, of course, the king, Henry VIII, can't flatten a round earth, and of course, parliament couldn't make a flat earth round. So he was not only appealing to the common sense of the jurors, but to their understanding of the natural law of the order of things that even governments are subject to. From that, he proceeded to argue that among our natural rights is freedom of thought. And the essential aspect of freedom of thought, as much as it is speech, it is silence. Lost the argument, he lost his head. 400 years later, unlike Paul VI, he had to wait 400 years. Another argument for another time, dear Nick. He was canonized. He's the patron saint of lawyers. You know, you can commit a lot of sins and still be a saint if you embrace martyrdom at the end. Even though his wife said to him, Thomas, you're not a martyr. He goes, you're right, this is not the stuff of which martyrdom is made, but if it comes, we must embrace it. I use that a lot in my talks.
Right. Talk about why is the natural law so important to you, and why should it concern people in 21st century America?
Well, it's important to me because it was important to the framers. And every one of the framers understood the importance of the natural law as a natural check on the government. What is it? It's the area, I'm pointing to my heart, it's the area of human behavior for which we don't need a government permission slip. And you can basically go through the Bill of Rights. Your right to think as you wish, to say what you think, to publish what you say, your right to worship or not to worship, to associate or not to associate, to petition the government, your right to shoot at the government when it's taken over by tyrants, the quintessential American right, and the Fourth Amendment, the right to be left alone. These are aspects of our humanity. They are not subject to majoritarian impulses. The majority can't take them away. John Locke, a favorite philosopher of Jefferson, once said, the majority can no longer silence one person. If all the world but one thinks something, the whole world could not morally silence that one any more than he, if he had the power, could silence the whole world. I've told Bill O'Reilly he should be grateful for that argument. But that's the essence of the natural law, that nobody can take your rights away from you, not the government, not a king. You give your rights up if you violate somebody else's natural rights. So when a thief robs the bank, he gives up his own right to be free. He doesn't give up the rights of the bank to be divested of its wealth. He just gives up his own right to be free because he stole the money. He stole property that wasn't his.
Let's talk about the title of the book, Suicide Pact, because this is, it's a phrase that everybody knows, that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. The explication of the case, of the Supreme Court case that comes out of this, is fascinating.
Okay, this also has to do with my day job. Where I work with a lot of people who, when I defend the primacy of the individual and our natural rights, say to me, the Constitution's not a suicide pact. And I'd say, where'd you get that from? Well, I don't know where I got it from, but I know it makes sense. The Constitution's not a suicide pact. Some judge said it during World War II.
And the idea that it's not a suicide pact is that,
is that our rights are not absolute, and the government can curtail those rights in bad times and expand them in good times. By the way, that argument, that the government can curtail them in bad and expand them in good, is the opposite of the natural law. That's what's called positivism. That's what brought us Nazism and communism and fascism, when the government can tinker with your rights in order to strengthen itself. So a very famous case, it's post-World War II, it's 1949 Chicago, it's the Red Scare era, it's the Joe McCarthy era, and a very famous sort of radical Catholic priest by the name of Arthur Terminiello.
And let's say, not sort of radical, he was out
He
there.
was over the top.
Yeah.
He made you and me seem moderate, is giving a speech, and his purpose is to arouse the audience, and the audience hates them. They are there to be aroused. So the audience begins to storm the stage, and the Chicago police say, Father Terminiello, you got to get out of here. We can't protect you. He basically tells the cops what they can go do with themselves. The audience storms the stage, destroys the building, and instead of arresting the audience members who did the damage, they arrest Father Terminiello. Convicted in a Chicago trial court, upheld in a Chicago appellate court, upheld by the Illinois Supreme Court, reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court, arguing that the First Amendment value of the freedom of speech is so broad, so expansive, it will tolerate the violence of the listener. And by the way, you guys in Chicago, you should have arrested the people that stormed the stage, because that's not protected, but speech is protected. Justice Robert Jackson, who left the Supreme Court to become the chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, and when the Nuremberg trials were over, went right back to his job in the Supreme Court, a movement today that is unthinkable, but happened at the time, dissented, and in the dissent used this phrase, the Constitutional Bill of Rights is not a suicide pact. That dissent is outdated, has never been followed, and though I respect a lot of what Justice Jackson did, he mentored a young lawyer named Bill Rehnquist, who eventually became an admirable Chief Justice. The phrase is meaningless. I use it all the time because the neocons love it. And when you get in an argument with a neocon about suicide pact, read the Apologia in here and you'll blow your neocon adversaries away.
You talk about, in the context of 21st century presidential action, Bush was the great tragedy, but Obama has become the great hypocrite. How was Bush a tragic figure in terms of the expansion and abuse of presidential power?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll give you an anecdote and then I'll talk big picture. In the Bush administration, it became known that FBI agents were showing up at post offices and intimidating postal inspectors to turn over the mail. A postal inspector is a cop in a uniform with a badge and a gun whose job is to ensure that the mail is not interfered with. An FBI agent is a cop not in a uniform with a badge and a gun, not visible. They intimidated the postal agents. A Republican Congress wrote a piece of legislation and passed it. Thou shalt not interfere with the mail. You want to open up the mail? Go to a judge, present probable cause, get a search warrant from a judge. Perfectly consistent with the Fourth Amendment. As George W. Bush was signing this piece of legislation into law, literally as the ink in the pen in his fingers was flowing onto the page, he stopped and looked up to the camera and said, by the way, I have no intention whatsoever of enforcing this law. Now, that attitude that I can nullify what the Congress has done, magnify it to today. It's the same value of Barack Obama, who says, you 5 million people that I don't want to deport, do my A, B, C, D, and E, and I won't deport you. And how did Obama do this? Well, he's doing it as we speak, but one of the academic, if you will, bases for it was things like what Bush did, because it was uninterfered with by the courts and uninterfered with by the Congress. The Congress is as much at fault as the president for doing nothing. When Barack Obama bombed Libya while Congress was on spring break, you remember that? It's about 2009, 2010. He literally sent American bombs to destroy American military equipment that American taxpayers had paid for and given to Gaddafi. Caused chaos. Gaddafi's dead. Arguably, the nonsense in Benghazi and the assassination of our ambassador happens as a result of this. Did Congress do anything? Nothing. Was it lawful? No. It wasn't even lawful under the War Powers Resolution, which is of dubious constitutionality. And George W. Bush, of course, brought us into an unlawful war under false pretenses. He tortured people. He spied on people. Barack Obama's greatest sin, in my view, is his belief that he can kill Americans, and his execution, his murder of Americans, uncharged, untried, unprosecuted, unconvicted, unsentenced. It would have been unlawful for the FBI or the CIA to have kidnapped them and brought them here because they weren't even charged with a crime. If they had been indicted and they refused to show up, there's some law that allows the kidnapping. What's Barack Obama's legal theory? What did Eric Holder, the enabler, say to him? Where due process is inconvenient, the president can be judge, jury, and executioner. Jefferson and Madison and William O. Douglas and everybody who took a stand for human liberty would be turning in their graves.
Do you think that this type of action, and I doubt that most of us, obviously have a sharpened understanding of the legal kind of pyrotechnics and gymnastics that are going on here, but when you start to see authority figures, and the president is a stand-in for ultimate authority, start fooling around with stuff, saying like, I'm signing this law, but I'm not going to follow it, or Obama coming in and saying, you know what, I'm going to stop doing everything George Bush said, except I'm actually going to do more of it and do it in more extreme ways where I can even, I have a secret kill list. What is the effect on the population? What is the effect on the American voter?
Well, when it's done during wartime, and let's face it, Nick, in your lifetime and mine, we have been in a state of perpetual war, perpetual debt, and government control of human liberty. Those are the three areas that both political parties' leadership agree on. But when it's done in wartime, people usually opt for safety over liberty. People will pay more taxes and stand on a ration line and do what the president tells them. So that's why George W. Bush and Barack Obama are able to get away with this, because the public buys the nonsense that this is going to keep them safe.
By the same token, you point out in the book that when Bush left office, only a third of people approved of the job he had done. 2/3 were against it. Obama is sinking in the poll and is on kind of a trajectory to be out of office with similar bad numbers. Does it ultimately build up and hollow out the concept of legitimate authority? And is that a problem? We're also talking about this as the Eric Garner, or rather the grand jury that was supposed to look at the death of Eric Garner under the NYPD does not return an indictment, not a guilty sentence, but rather just can we do a trial to find out what happened?
The one good thing that may come from Bush's abuse of power and Obama's taking it on steroids, so to speak, is that the person who wrote the foreword to this book is rising in the polls and in interest, and the interest is being shown in uniquely un-Republican areas of the populace, inner city blacks, college youth. Rand Paul, who wrote a very, very generous foreword, is really the only type of person with that mentality who would reverse this inexorable march toward authoritarianism. And such a reversal would need to come on the heels of great abuse, the likes of which we see today.
And I mean, do you have a sense, we talk at Reason a lot about the libertarian moment. You're certainly part of it. You're rising profile. A lot of the people at Fox who are libertarian, people like Rand Paul, Justin Amash, libertarian Republicans, interest from the Democrats or from liberals who are like, you know what, we got to change the way we're doing things. Is it possible that that's what is going to rise out of the ashes here?
Well, I think it is, and I'll give you an example. You talked about the Eric Garner tragedy in New York City. One of the people making the most out of this tragedy is one of my colleagues in the media, though not at Fox, the Reverend Al Sharpton. 2 weeks ago, Al Sharpton had breakfast with Rand Paul. And at the end of the breakfast, he told his colleagues at MSNBC, this is the most dangerous man running for the Democrats. Why? Because we will not be able to count on the votes of inner city blacks the way we used to. Many of them may vote for him. That is one of the most startling revelations that can come from Obama's excesses.
And just to follow up with Rand Paul, in his intro, in his foreword to the book, which is great, as is the whole book, he writes that the biggest question is whether a judge's warrant, of the questions you raise here, the biggest question is whether a judge's warrant is needed for a search of third-party information.
Well, you see, the Patriot Act, truly one of the most abominable and unconstitutional pieces of legislation since the Alien and Sedition Act, allows federal agents to search third parties. By third parties, it would be somebody who has records on you, lawful records on you, your telephone company, your computer server, your doctor, your lawyer, your supermarket. FBI agents can write their own search warrants and serve them on the third party. And when they serve them on the third party, they say to that third party, you can't tell anybody about this. You can't tell your spouse in the bedroom, your lawyer in her office, a priest in confessional. You can't even tell a judge in a public courtroom, because if you tell somebody, we'll prosecute you for speech. All of that is in the Patriot Act, and Rand Paul rails against it.
And, people like Edward Snowden, the revelations that came out of various things from WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, these broadened our understanding of how much surveillance and how much kind of creepy crawly is going on. Where a single search warrant somehow or a single law is used as the pretext to search millions, if not billions, of records. How do we push back against that? I mean, beyond making...
Well, we need to push back against it either by having a president who could stop it with the stroke of a pen or a phone call, or by scaring members of Congress out that they're going to lose their jobs, they're going to be voted out of office if they permit this to continue. One of the things that affected Congress the most was when it realized that it was being spied on by the executive branch.
Right.
That too arguably violates the separation of powers. Who runs the NSA? The president. People are spying on Congress? What member of Congress would tolerate that when they can stop it with a simple majority vote?
You also teach first-year law at Brooklyn Law School. You teach constitutional law and other introductory courses. Do you have a sense? Are you confident that the lawyers in training now will be fierce defenders of the Constitution?
I teach the basic course in the Constitution, which is basically 200 famous Supreme Court cases that all lawyers need to know in order to pass the bar exam. I also teach an advanced course on legal philosophy and on theories of interpreting the Constitution. I taught these things at Seton Hall Law School in Newark 20 years ago. Today, and these law schools are roughly about the same. They draw roughly from the same socioeconomic demographic. They are roughly ranked the same nationally, and they're both inner city. I see a far more passionate grasp of civil liberties today than I did 20 years ago.
Well,
in fact, the comparison is not even close.
I'm kind of sorry to hear that, because people are intensified on these, or have lit on these issues, because they're being abused.
And of course they're being abused. Look, one of my dear friends in the media is one of the funniest guys in the world, Jon Stuart. First time I'm on there with him, I said to him, hey, John, I'm going to out you tonight. What do you mean you're going to out me? I'm going to out you as a closet libertarian. I went through a half dozen issues. Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. Yes, I agree. oh my God, I can't go home tonight. I'm a libertarian.
Well, we will leave it there. We've been talking with Judge Andrew P. Napolitano. He's on Fox News all the time, and he's the author of the tremendous new book, Suicide Pact, The Radical Expansion of Presidential Powers and the Assault on Civil Liberties. Judge, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. All the best.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.
Successes are well known, but among the more egregious is the suspension of writ of habeas corpus, and arresting 3,000 newspaper publishers in the North for being critical of him in their editorials. Woodrow Wilson had FBI agents arrest people for singing German songs in public and for reciting the Declaration of Independence outside of draft boards. FDR had FBI agents confiscate gold. He forgot that only the Congress could make the ownership of gold unlawful. The theme is not only war, because war is the health of the state.
The assault on civil liberties. This is a history going back to the early Republican period. You say that the driving force here is war, real and imagined. Talk
Yes.
A little bit about that.
Yes, well, the first half of this book is a history of presidential lawmaking and law-breaking, starting with George Washington and going to Bill Clinton. Second half of the book focuses in great detail on the executive orders and the unlawful actions of George W. Bush and Barack Obama. So a lot of the historical stuff is familiar to readers and some is not familiar. It's interesting. I find that if readers went to a public high school, they don't know a lot of the history in here. If they were homeschooled or if they went to a private school or a religious school, they know a lot of this stuff.
What explains that?
The public schools have a built-in need to reinforce the primacy of government as the benefactor of our rights.
So talk about, just very quickly, and I want to spend most of our time talking about Obama and George Bush,
Right.
W. Bush, but George Washington, what was the original sin here?
Well, George Washington actually engaged in a lot of bizarre activity involving his slaves, much of which is owned. Remember, the first capital of the country was Philadelphia, and the Pennsylvania legislature required manumission of slaves after 6 months. So George and Martha just ran the slaves up from Mount Vernon, and at the end of the 6 months just send them back. So they had a continual train of slaves. Unfortunately, when they tried to escape, he cut their toes off. And unfortunately, when he and his children needed teeth, he pulled their teeth out. One of the more egregious things about George Washington was his chopping the heads off of soldiers in the Continental Army. So he wasn't yet the president. There wasn't yet a country, even though they were volunteers. John Adams, we see prosecuting people for speech under the Alien and Sedition Acts. Abraham Lincoln's ex Jefferson and Madison and William O. Douglas and everybody who took a stand for human liberty would be turning in their graves.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Judge Andrew Napolitano. He's a Fox News legal analyst, and he is the author of many books, most recently the brand new book with a foreword by Rand Paul. It's called Suicide Pact, The Radical Expansion of Presidential Powers and the Assault on Civil Liberties. Judge, thanks for talking to us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Nick.
All right, let's get right to it. The radical expansion of presidential powers and the